Welcome to the Chapter 3 Stigma podcast. This podcast was created to be there for any individual who feels that they are at a low point in life and are confused, seemingly alone, and helpless in their situation. I am a recovering alcoholic, and I felt this way too, until I sat across a table from another addict who shared his story and made me realize that I was not alone in my struggles. My life was saved by this realization, and I hope to help anyone struggling by sharing my story to show you that you are not alone and that life can contain unbelievable riches and meaning. Welcome. I am glad you are here. Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Chapter 3 Stigma podcast. For today's episode, I'm very excited to start getting into a new body of work, one that I have been looking forward to and thinking and planning a lot about. And the reason behind this and my motivations for wanting to cover this body of work is I see it as one of the most important pieces of both literature and just overall thinking that our Western culture has produced up to this point. And specifically on the topic of purpose, meaning, suffering, and generally speaking, the human spirit. This was a body of work that I actually read twice. And that is really one of the primary reasons that I want to cover it under the umbrella of the Chapter 3 Stigma project and podcast because it had a profound effect on me. The first time that I read it, I was desperately in search for an answer. It was within the last few months of my battle with alcoholism and really searching for and striving for an answer on my own to a lot of questions that I had. And the second time that I went through and read this book was in the months after entering into recovery. And the shocking thing for me was, though the words in the print were exactly the same, I realized that I was getting a whole different set of learnings and takeaways from the book. And so I had always thought that it would be really interesting to go over this in detail and cover those two different perspectives and really try to drill down into understanding why, upon a second reading, I got such a vastly different experience and different outcome from it. In all honesty, just kind of grounding with the timeline that I've portrayed with regards to my recovery journey, I cannot recall if the second time that I read this came before or after finding out about Lucy's health condition. The only reason I call that out and feel it is important is that was such a monumental shift in just my spiritual grounding and beliefs and really my outlook on life. So I did want to just drop in that caveat. I just can't recall when in that timeline I wound up reading this a second time. But again, I think even disregarding that understanding, doing this analysis, kind of the before and after recovery read of this content is going to be really powerful. So the book and the piece of literature that I'm going to cover here in the next coming episodes, I'm not sure how many it will be, is Viktor Frankl's work called Man's Search for Meaning. In all likelihood, you have probably heard about this book. Largely, I viewed and see this book as a story of survival. At the time when I first picked it up and got into it, I was really desperate to read survival tales and understand really the constraints that I was putting on myself with regards to how much the human spirit could put up with and how far it could be pushed. I knew I was struggling. I knew I was coming towards what felt like an end where I just couldn't handle or take it any longer. And I was really desperately reaching for these tales of survival. That's something I kind of took away after the fact. In all reality, I went to this book purely because of the title. Again, Man's Search for Meaning. I knew down in my core that I had no sense of purpose, no sense of direction in life. When it came down to my battle with alcoholism, it all felt desperate. It all felt pointless, as well as just life in general. And that was one of the things that just constantly ate at me. So again, when I first read this book, I was truly searching for some kind of formula to either, one, explain my struggles and help me connect with and understand why I was struggling so much to figure out what my meaning, what my purpose was, and find joy and connection again in life. Or subsequently, I was also hopeful or looking for some sort of roadmap to guide me to resolution, to help me figure out my problem with alcoholism. And I can say with all honesty, I got neither out of this book when I read it. So, it just, I think it just kind of shows, like, talking through that experience, really how desperate I was at that point in my life. I would call this like February through May of 2023 before I entered into rehab. And again, just clawing at and searching for, quite honestly, desperately for anything that would help me. So some history regarding the actual book. I'm not going to get into the literal work today outside of a few just like sentence call outs to sort of set the stage. But the history of the work is, it was really a bedrock when it was first published for an entirely new line of philosophical and psychological thought. So Sigmund Freud largely supported the idea and promoted the idea that life is nothing but a quest for pleasure. Another psychologist, Adler, detailed life as a quest for power. What Viktor Frankl brought to the scene and promoted with his thesis is viewing the life through a lens of a pursuit of meaning. And so when it comes down to meaning, purpose, what is the actual definition of that, and how do you go about discovering it? When I first read this book, that was my obsessive question, and that was my obsessive quest, really in those final weeks and months of fighting my alcoholism. I hoped I could inject myself with this incredible sense of meaning by reading this story, detailing it, connecting with the lessons that are taken from it. But I just didn't know how to find that. And really the takeaway from the work, the highest level, Frankl believed that meaning could be discovered really in three sources. Your work. So what that meant was doing or building something of significance. Love. He defined that as caring for another person. And then finally, courage during difficult times. Now, as I was preparing for this podcast, again, wanting to draw the distinction between the lens that I was taking the first and the last time, or the second time that I read this, as I went through those three sources, work, that was an easy one for me when I was struggling with alcoholism. I found no meaning from work. Work was just something that I had to do. I wasn't getting the creative outlet that I felt like I needed through work. And it truly was just something that I was logging on and doing. The love portion, again, the way Viktor Frankl frames it, specifically caring for another person, this source and this idea agonized me. I really sat around and beat myself up and berated myself and wondered, why is my family, why are my loved ones not enough to break me from these alcoholic cycles? And again, I think in reading this book, it actually wound up tormenting me more, because here it was written right in front of my face, the idea that love and caring for another person should be enough to inject meaning into your life. And I was sitting there totally falling apart and struggling, even though I felt love and I said that I love, and I tried to act and carry out my love for others, my family in particular. It obviously was not enough to break me from this alcoholic cycle. And so I just agonized over that fact. And then finally, courage during difficult times. This was another one that was incredibly difficult for me to read, because I knew, just looking at it face value, I was clearly falling apart. And then finally, first, before I go through the after lens on these three items, a very famous saying that is referenced in this work multiple times is, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." And as I've alluded to, and I'll just very bluntly clarify here, this statement drove me absolutely crazy when I was struggling with alcoholism. I was tormented over the fact that my family, my loved ones, did not seem enough of a why for me to break from this cycle. And I just agonized over this idea. This was a burden that I truly felt like I was carrying with me constantly. And I just did not understand and did not know how to break. And it wasn't until I entered into recovery that those things started to change and shift for me. So that on a second read, I got a different lens and perspective. And so working back through that, the three sources after recovery on a second read, work, what I found was the most energizing, the best creative outlet. I actually started to feel like I gained creativity energy back, because prior to entering into recovery, all of my creative output was going towards maintaining the lie that I had going around my drinking and obsessively hiding my drinking. Now, after I had entered into recovery, I had all this leftover creativity, and ultimately what it first started off as is refocusing that energy towards that boring 9-to-5 job that I had. And I've covered it here before, but the crazy experience for me was how much more pleasure, how much more enjoyment and fulfillment I wound up getting from my same old boring, mundane 9-to-5 work, because I was starting to inject some of that creativity. And while it wasn't an overwhelming sense of purpose or meaning, I did start to realize some real meaning that came from the work that I did. Now, after the loss of Lucy, when I made the decision to start creating this Chapter 3 Stigma body of work, that's really where the work portion of this did take a noticeable jump up in terms of gaining actual meaning. And, it's like when I hear from individuals that these messages, either writing or podcasting, have touched on topics of importance and significance in people's lives, that is just, that experience has really revolutionized the way that I look at life and decide how to talk about things and approach relationships. On the source of love, after entering recovery, as I've covered here before, a big part of my recovery journey was, first of all, figuring out how to love and care for myself. And it was only through figuring that out that I could then truly extend the love and caring and affection that I had so desperately wanted to show to others. Only then could I authentically do it. So loving myself created the opportunity for me to love others and to create meaning through this aspect of caring for another person. And then finally, and tightly coupled with the love source, the courage during difficult times. After the obvious experience that we had was going through Lucy's, growth, health, and life, and the hardships that came along with the loss of her. And really, the thing that stands out the most to me that I gain a lot of meaning and purpose through is, despite everything that happened, despite everything that we went through, never feeling anger towards God for the situation that we were faced with Lucy and her health condition. It may sound odd, but that is one of the more meaningful aspects of her entire life that I have taken away and experienced. And it just showed how strong that we can be. And I use we in the terms of myself and my relationship with God, but also my entire family, and watching what we went through and how we did get out of bed each day and stand up and face what was in front of us. And so, just in covering those three aspects or sources of which meaning can be extracted, at least based on Frankl's observation, it really was a profound and cataclysmic shift for me in only a few months' time between reading it the first time and reading it the second time. Moving on, one thing that is addressed very often in this book is suffering and the point of suffering well, things along those lines, and just extracting a quote from the work. Quote, "Suffering in and of itself is meaningless. We give our suffering meaning by the way in which we respond to it." End quote. Really, over the last year and a half, so even after I have entered into recovery, I have actually probably put the most work behind understanding the role of suffering in life. Just going through the experience with Lucy, having a sick child, not knowing what life would look like in the long term, given that situation. I think what I experienced was my pendulum really traveled far and wide with regards to how I viewed and thought about suffering. But given what I've learned and experienced, I think this statement that I just read is really one of the truest statements I've ever come across regarding suffering and meaning and finding purpose within that suffering. Ultimately, having a belief that there is a point to the suffering is key. When I was struggling with my alcoholism, I did not know, even after I entered in recovery, I did not know or understand what the point of that suffering was. And that was okay to start. I was trusting, I had faith. And for me, just the bit of a unique situation and scenario that we had, my perspective was everything clicked when we went through and were faced with what we had to face with Lucy. I then was able to look back and see that alcoholism was, in a way I never could have predicted, building us up and giving us the capability to face what we were about to face with Lucy's life. I think this is where the spiritual aspect and truly having faith comes into play, because when you are in the throes of a difficult situation that brings suffering upon you, I would argue more often than not, it is not clear what the purpose of that suffering is. And what I have learned and discovered is that moment, that is the test of your faith. How strong is your faith in a higher power, in God, that what you are going through right now has meaning and purpose because of how it's going to come back and ready you or impact you for a future situation. So to kind of close out this week's podcast and set up the work of getting into Viktor Frankl's book here, for those that aren't aware, this book starts out, it's in two parts, and the first part is actually entirely experience-based. So Viktor Frankl details his stories, his observations of his time as a prisoner in the concentration camps of World War II. And he observes others, and he notes how men, how he was primarily in units with men, but how people in general, and I'm going to the book here, quote, may remain brave, dignified, and unselfish, or in the bitter fight for self-preservation, may forget his human dignity and become no more than an animal. A big premise of the book is the former, that brave, dignified, unselfish individual, was rare. But Dr. Frankl's point in this piece of work is that even one example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength may raise him above his outward fate. I apologize, that was a quote there. So the question then is, why and how does an individual fall into the former category? Again, that brave, dignified, and unselfish individual. I think ultimately that was my both fear and obsessive search when I first read this book. It was a fear because I felt and knew that in the moment I couldn't step up to a calling, to a real calling in life if needed. And one of Dr. Frankl's most powerful insights, and one that I struggled with incredibly hard in my battle with alcoholism, but that completely transformed and changed when we were supporting Lucy and Alyssa in Lucy's fight for life, was this, that forces beyond your personal control can strip everything away from you except for one aspect, for one single thing, and that is your ability to choose how you will respond to the situation at hand. You cannot control most of what happens in your life. The only thing you can control is how you feel, how you think, and what you do about what is happening to you. And that feel, think, and do, or action portion, is something that we will get into. Like, how do those things order out? How are they structured? How did all of that cascade for me when I was struggling with alcoholism versus now that I'm in recovery? And finally, I feel and think that the real power of Dr. Frankl's work is that it is entirely grounded in experience. In his story, he had begun his exploration of the power of meaning prior to the war and prior to the concentration camp experience. But then he lived it and he observed it and he took things away from that experience, and he wrote, again, one of the most powerful pieces of literature and pieces of work on the topic of purpose and meaning, and quite frankly, living a quality, authentic life. To close this chapter, I'm actually going to read the final sentence of the book, of the first part of the book. So to the book. We have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer, or Shema Yisrael, on his lips. That's all I've got for this week. Thanks all. Love you. If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with others who might find it impactful, and give us a rating through your streaming platform of choice. Ratings and comments help spread the work to others who are desperately searching for a solution. This simple action could have profound impacts on the lives of others. My hope is that my story can help those who feel alone in their struggles with addiction or any other aspects of life. You can follow us on social media at Chapter 3 Stigma on Instagram and YouTube. If you want to reach out with a message through one of those channels, I will respond and let you know that you are not alone. All the best, you are loved, and know that this life is full of abundant joy and wonder, and is worth every struggle and bit of suffering you must endure. Until next time.